Thanks all for joining us this morning. I am really thrilled to have Professor Kwall Bobby join us. As some of you know, because some of you are her students or have lots of history or were her children's babysitters or all sorts of things, or her machatanim or all sorts of good things. Roberta Rosenthal Kwall is the Raymond P. De Niro professor at DePaul. She earned her JD from the University of Pennsylvania. Oh, that's the other thing we have in common, Bobby. I'm a Quaker. And received her undergraduate degree in religious studies from Brown. She also has a master's degree in Jewish studies. She is an internationally renowned scholar and lecturer, and she writes and speaks on Jewish law and culture, authorship rights, and intellectual property. She's also written many op-eds, articles, and book reviews on various topics of interest in the Jewish community. At DePaul, she teaches courses in family law, property, intellectual property, and family law, and the Jewish tradition. Some of you may know that DePaul, I don't know the official name of the Center of Jewish Law at DePaul, which is an amazing program doing really, really great work.
Thank you.
Accomplished author and has written a book that some of you may have read, some of you may not have read, but you still can read it after today. I'm going to put the link in the chat a little later in our discussion. Remixed Judaism, which is a really thoughtful, interesting, incredibly well-researched book. Oh my gosh, you quote all these people I've looked up to, old, new, and in between. And we're really excited to have you with us this morning with your wonderful connections to NSCI through family and through returning to us to teach. So what we're going to do is I'm going to ask Bobby a couple of questions, and I'm going to let her run talking about the book and the topic, and then we'll come to questions afterwards. So I'm going to start out really basically, which is, why'd you write the book?
Why did I write the book? That's a great question. And, I really always like to hear the backstories of books. I like to hear why authors write their books and what it is that authors found compelling about the topic. So I love that that's our first question. That's your first question, Rabbi Lisa. So I wrote this book. There's a little bit of a trajectory, so I will share that. As Rabbi Lisa mentioned, my initial area of legal expertise was, of course, property, but really I did most of my writing in intellectual property, which is essentially copyrights and trademarks. And as an intellectual property scholar, I focused a lot on a particular doctrine known as moral rights. But what moral rights basically is the law that should protect the personal interests of an author's work. So protecting an author from allowing an author attribution for their work to be named, and also preventing works from being modified without the author's permission. Long story short, the US has the worst protections for moral rights in the entire world. That's a whole nother lecture, which I'd be happy to talk about sometime, because it meshes with what is the Jewish view of human creativity. But what is important for purposes of this talk is that it occurred to me one day, I had this eureka moment. And the eureka moment was the same questions that I was asking about works of authorship protected by copyright law, meaning how much can they be modified and still be considered the work of the author, right? Because that was a foundational question for determining how the law, the secular law, would be applied. It occurred to me one day that you can ask the same question about Jewish tradition. How much can Jewish tradition be changed and still be Jewish tradition? I think that's always been the foundational question throughout our history, not just for liberally religious Jews, okay, which I'm going to be talking a lot about this morning, but for all Jews, right? And so because I was so captivated with that question, I actually wrote a book called The Myth of the Cultural Jew, which I actually spoke in person at North Shore probably about 6 years ago. And that book is basically, it's a little more of an academic treatment. Remixed Judaism is written for a wide audience. The Myth of the Cultural Jew really was a book primarily targeted to law professors and Jewish studies people and scholars. It had lots of footnotes, which were all very long. At the end of my time writing that, my primary mentor was actually Vernon Hurwitz, who was my professor at Spertus and also the rabbi of North Suburban Synagogue Bethel, where I am now a member. And Vernon said to me, Bobby, you're doing so much with this book. He said, leave the practical application of what you're doing for something for another day, is what he really said to me. And what had happened was toward the end of my writing of The Myth of the Cultural Jew, it was published in 2015. I was finishing up the manuscript in 2013. And in 2013, lo and behold, the Pew Institute released its first report on which was the first major study of the American Jewish community. It was the largest major study up until that point of the United States Jewish community. So just out of curiosity, those of you who I can see, how many of you have heard of the Pew Report or know about the Pew Report? Okay, some of you do, some of you don't. It was a big deal. It's still a big deal. When it was published, the first report was published in 2013. There were some positive things. There were a lot of not so positive things about where Judaism was going, and particularly Judaism from the standpoint of what I'm going to call liberally religious. So I wanted to find what I mean by that, because people are always, asking, what do you mean by liberally religious? I don't mean politics. What I mean are people essentially that are not living squarely within the system of Jewish law. And who am I referring to? I'm really referring to really non-Orthodox Jews. Although, there might be some Orthodox Jews who actually do and appreciate the concept of remix. And some of them actually endorse my book and have spoken quite highly about it and reviewed it. But for the most part, I am talking to and dealing with liberally religious Jews. That includes the Jews at Bethel. It includes the Jews at North Shore. It includes the Jews at, probably the 100+ synagogues that I have spoken at throughout the past 2 years when my book originally was launched, which was exactly 2 years ago. It was right before COVID. So I am dealing with Jews who are not living squarely within the system of Jewish law, who are not necessarily dotting the I's and crossing the T's of Jewish law. Those are basically the people that Remix Judaism is essentially written for. So in Remix Judaism, I actually like I do a lot of storytelling. I think stories are a wonderful way that we learn about tradition, and particularly about the Jewish tradition. We have narrative from the Torah. We have narrative from the Talmud, and narrative from the Talmud is called Agadah. And I do a lot of biblical narrative. I do a lot of Talmudic narrative, and I also do other stories. I do personal stories. I do stories of the interesting things I found in the media, of other people's stories, some of which I'll talk about today. And then I have some personal narrative in there as well. But when I do Talmudic Agadah, which I do throughout the book, it's really important to me that my readers get a sense of the worldview of the Talmudic sages. And the only way to really get that sense is by really doing a direct translation of the language of the Talmud. So I don't summarize the Talmudic passages. I actually use a direct English translation of the original language, which is usually, of course, Aramaic. And so I want to start with a wonderful narrative. This is one of my favorite narratives. It's from the Babylonian Talmud. And it concerns a man known as Honi. Honi is kind of famous in the Talmudic world for actually, in conjunction with praying for rain and causing rain, he's known as the circle maker. But in the context of this narrative, his role is actually something very different. So I want to read to you this narrative, which really sets out Remix Judaism in a good way. So one day, Honi was journeying on the road, and he saw a man planting a carob tree. He asked him, "How long does it take for this tree to bear fruit?" The man replied, 70 years. He then further asked him, "Are you certain you will live another 70 years?" The man replied, "I found ready-grown carob trees in this world. As my forefathers planted them for me, so too do I plant them for my children." Honi sat down to have a meal, and sleep overcame him. As he slept, a rocky formation enclosed upon him, which hid him from sight, and he continued to sleep for another 70 years. This is Talmudic Agadah. You got to take the timing with a grain of salt, of course. When he awoke, he saw a man gathering the fruit of the carob tree, and he asked him, "Are you the man who planted the tree?" The man replied, this gets me every time, "I am his grandson." It's such a powerful, powerful narrative. So what do we learn from this narrative? We learn, first of all, that it is the job of one generation to plant the path for the next generation. If Jewish continuity is important, And it is to me, okay, that I've got to acknowledge that at the outset. Yes, it's very important to me. It is up to the prior generations to plant that path for the subsequent generations. But also in the context of remix, I like to analogize the carob fruit to Jewish tradition. We always want there to be carob fruit in this world, just like we always want there to be Jewish tradition in this world. But the fruit may look a little bit different and taste a little bit different and feel a little bit different from one generation to another, and the same is true of Jewish tradition. And again, if we think that there has never been modifications to Jewish tradition in the 2000 years of our legal history, the answer to that is no, there's been tons of modifications. It's just that in modernity, the nature and the extent of these modifications have become, and I'm going to use this word very intentionally, have become contested. There's been disagreement over different groups of Jews as to how much can and should be modified. But as I argued in The Myth of the Cultural Jew, modification was the norm in the development of Jewish law. Okay, so what is remixed Judaism and why is it important? I think remixed Judaism is very important for religiously liberal Jews because by and large, religiously liberal Jews do not observe Jewish tradition. They don't practice what they practice because they feel commanded to by God. Now, I'm not saying they don't believe in God, okay? I'm not saying they don't have faith. What I'm saying is this notion of having to observe, being commanded to observe, is not something that resonates, at least with the majority of religiously liberal Jews. And if you don't take my word for that, okay, this is what I believe based on all of my anecdotal experience and all the reading I've done. But a far greater authority than me on this point is Chancellor Arnie Eisen, who was the former chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, which is the conservative movement seminary. And the conservative movement, at least operates from the top down, namely the rabbinic authorities, a little bit more within the framework of Jewish law. And even Arnie Eisen wrote in an article that came out actually after my book was published. And he said in all of his travels through all of the synagogues that he went to, and these were probably mostly conservative synagogues, he said, and I quote, "It is not uncommon for the Jews to engage in behaviors not warranted by their beliefs. And this is true even for himself. He provides a compelling case for remixed Judaism," right? All right, so what is remixed Judaism? And what are the elements? So the elements that I think are really, really critical to remixed Judaism, I want to talk about.
Bobby, can I jump in for 1 second?
Absolutely.
I want to underline and, dare I say, rephrase what you just said.
Sure.
When you first said it, it could be heard different ways. I mean, what I heard you say, what it came out is that people aren't doing, but it's not that they're not doing, it's that they're not doing out of obligation.
Like a sense of
not observing out of obligation.
Right.
Yeah.
So, which I think is a really important thing. So that notion, I just want to sort of step back with that. So for halachic Jews, for those who consider themselves halachic, who may be Orthodox, who may be conservative, who may be Reform, the understanding is that we do things because Jewish law obligates us to do it. And conservative Judaism, there's more room in that for adaptation, but there are many who consider themselves halachic, some who don't. Within Reform Judaism, there are those who consider themselves halachic. They're in a smaller portion or smaller percentage. Many people do because they feel it's the right thing to do or the Jewish thing to do or they're good people. But if you ask a conversation about commandedness or obligation, I completely agree with you. I just wanted to underline that in a different way because I think it's important to lift up is people are doing, but there may be different thinking behind it. And P.S. for years, at least once a year, I raise the notion of do you feel commanded or obligated to do certain things? And people will say they do lots of things and feel the need to, but that language is very uncomfortable for many people. Go on.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much, Rabbi Lise. I'm really glad that you stepped in with that and clarified that. I agree with that. I agree with that completely. That is exactly the point, right, that I was making. And I really appreciated Rabbi Lisa's elucidation upon that concept. And again, I think there are some, particularly in the very most traditional sectors of conservative Judaism, particularly maybe on the rabbinic side, there is that sense of commandedness. I personally am kind of sympathetic to that in my own personal life, but I don't think it's the way the majority of conservative Jews think, and I think that's also true for the majority of liberally religious Jews as well. And so the point is, if the majority, and this religiously liberal group of Jews, who are they? If we're talking about 85% of American Jews, the majority of American Jews. Okay, that's who we're talking about. And so if Jews are going to observe, they need a different motivation. And I think Rabbi Lisa tapped into that in her comments, just a few moments ago. So I sort of want to unbundle that a little bit more by going through what I see as the primary elements of remixed Judaism, and then I'll give you some examples. So the first element is that people are going to exercise individuality over what they choose to do. They're not living squarely within the four corners of Jewish law, and therefore they're exercising a lot of discretion in terms of their choice. So that's number one. Number two, and this really taps into also what Rabbi Lisa just said, people then need to make what they do personally meaningful to themselves. If it's personally meaningful to you, you will observe it. If it's not, maybe not so much when you're dealing with the group that we're talking about here. So people have to infuse what they choose to observe with their own personal meaning. It has to be meaningful for them. Next, consistency. And this is really important, especially when you're talking about transmission. So here I will say that rituals that have a certain consistently, like first and foremost, Shabbat, which comes every week, but there are others as well, of course, give the opportunity, especially as teaching moments for next generations, to have them observe and learn that certain things are done consistently in Jewish tradition. And what is embraced by the group we're talking about does need to tap in to some degree, and there's no magic bullet here, and I don't have a magic bullet here, but it does need to tap into some degree to the authenticity of Jewish tradition. All right, so are certain things beyond the pale? Probably. Tonight, our job is not to say what is and what isn't, but to give some examples of how tapping into the authenticity can be achieved in various ritual examples that I'll give in a few moments. Also, respect for the tradition. It's one thing, to not observe everything, but to still make it clear, again, especially when you're talking about transmission, that this is something that is prized and respected, and something that we are not going to be denigrating. All right, so that is also really, really important. And finally, and this is again so important when you're dealing with transmission, you got to focus on the joy. If you focus on the negatives or the no's or the do nots, or no, we don't do this, we don't do that, we don't do this, we don't do that, you're missing opportunities to excite the next generation about all the joy in the tradition. And if you're talking about transmission, and you're talking particularly about the world in which we live in today, right? The joy, it's all about the joy. So that has to be first and foremost in terms of that. Now, as you can see from my selection of elements that I think are important, you'll see that when it comes to religiously liberal Jews, there are two, I call them A words, right? Two A words that are really important to religiously liberal Jews, but they point in opposite directions. So one is a word that I used before, and that's authenticity. Even though most liberally religious Jews may not be super religious, authenticity is important to them. I have heard so many times over the past 2 years when I've spoken all over the place at synagogues and federations and whatnot, so many Jews say to me, I don't want to do anything the wrong way. And rabbis tell me this too, that they hear this from their congregants. Reform rabbis tell me this, Reconstructing Jewish rabbis tell me this, and conservative rabbis tell me this. So there's a prize, there's a value that Jews feel toward authenticity. But the other A word is autonomy, right? Autonomy. I mean, liberally religious Jews value their autonomy, right? And they don't necessarily want to be told what to do, whether it comes to food, whether it comes to how they observe. So you've got that in that opposition going on, and it makes for some challenges. So I want to take a few minutes and give you some examples.
But it's not an opposition for everybody. I mean,
tell me what you're thinking.
Well, you are wonderfully and warmly and respectfully coming from a
position, it sounds, I could be wrong, that they're in opposition. But
yeah,
for Reform Jews who live with the integrity and history and belief that Reform Judaism comes out of an understanding of autonomy from educated choice, they're not in contradistinction to each other. They inform one another. Like,
so you're saying you're saying based on Reform's understanding of authenticity of the tradition, autonomy is part of the authenticity. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, for 200 plus years of Reform Judaism, the understanding is ideally, and this may not be this is not how everyone lives, I'm clear, but that we make educated choices by understanding the tradition, and then making meaningful Jewish decisions.
Yeah.
And so that doesn't mean, though it may not be that I need the authority or the approbation of the tradition. Ideally, I understand it and I don't just go, oh, like I don't keep kosher because my mother didn't keep kosher, end of subject, but I've thought about it, I've researched it, so they're not necessarily in tension within it. They are for many, but.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting point. I would love to contemplate that more. It's an interesting point. I think when I'm talking about authenticity, though, I think in my understanding of authenticity, I'm going back to, further back than to 200 years.
For sure. So, and I think we all want to feel that, and for me,
let me give you, can I give an example?
Go for it.
Let me give a couple examples that I think will, maybe elucidate the contradiction perhaps that we're talking about. But again, remix Judaism allows for meshing those contradictions. And so at the end of the day, I think it's a good way to sort of, explain both perhaps how Reform Judaism operates, and we'll talk more about Reform Judaism specifically, but also, other forms of liberally religious Judaism. So this is a great example, picking up on Rabbi Lisa's point. Jewish law, right, basically says you light your Shabbat candles 20 minutes before sundown. And by the way, people ask me all the time, if there's one thing you would recommend people do, what would that be? I get asked this question all the time, and it's great because I have a really good answer to it. If there's one thing I could recommend that every Jewish and even partially Jewish family do, it would be to take a 1-hour technology-free dinner on Friday night, precede it by lighting the Shabbat candles, saying the brachot over the wine and the bread, and then maybe the first paragraph of Birchat HaMazon, no technology during dinner, 1 hour. And if every Jewish family did that much, the Pew report, both the 2000 version and the one that just came out, the 2020 version, would look completely different. And frankly, it would be a lot more promising for the Jewish future here in the United States. So Shabbat is a really big deal, and it's a really important way of exercising, remix. So I get asked all the time, well, what do you think about lighting candles after sundown? It's a great question. So for me personally, I don't. I light my candles before sundown, or I just don't light them. But when I get asked that question, I usually respond by saying, do you believe striking a match is a sin? And I ask that question because lighting fire is one of the few biblically prohibited activities for Shabbat in the Torah, making fire. And I always get the same answer. No, of course, I don't believe that that's a sin. And then I say, well, look, I'm not a rabbi, I'm not a conservative rabbi. I don't have to adhere to any particular stringencies of halakha. I can just give you my opinion as a lay person, and that is, light your candles. Light your candles whenever you get home. Light your candles whenever you can. You want to designate that sacred time, sacred space, and make Shabbat at a time that you can do that, because the important thing is that you are making Shabbat and you are designating that Shabbat space and the onset of Shabbat, even if you're doing it in a way that actually violates Jewish law. So when I talk about authenticity, I'm really referring more to the question of what is considered authentic in the long-term tradition as a whole, such as lighting Shabbat candles. And so to me, that's a remix. It's a remix that's actually a remix by violating Jewish law. I'm actually okay with that, in terms of when I speak to people. I think people should be lighting their candles whenever they can light their candles if it doesn't bother them to do so. It's the act of lighting it and bringing Shabbat in that I think is so important. Here's another example of remix. I have a chapter on food. Those of you who actually know me well, I am not someone who loves to spend a lot of time in the kitchen. It's just not something I particularly enjoy. So when my agent said to me, you need a chapter on food, and she said, and you need to tell the stories of the chefs. And I said to her, Amaria, how am I going to do that? I don't really know any chefs personally. And she said, well, Bobby, you got to get their cookbooks and you got to read them and you've got to learn their stories. And I said, oh, all right, fine. So I actually went to the Bethel Library and I took out every single cookbook that Bethel has, and there's a lot of cookbooks. And I'm sitting there plowing through all of them. In fact, a friend of mine came in that day and she goes, oh, are you looking for recipe ideas for dinner? And I just laughed. I said, no, that would not happen, but I'm trying to get the stories of the chefs. I found amazing material in those cookbooks, right? So I have a chapter on food, which is actually one of my favorite chapters. It turned out to be, I was dreading writing it, but it turned out to be one of my favorite chapters. And I talk about that whole question of authenticity versus autonomy. It's so important in the food. In fact, Chef Laura Frankel, who's from this area, some of you may know Laura Frankel, she is actually, I interviewed her for that chapter, and she said, for many Jews, food is the final frontier. They don't want to be told what they can put in their mouths. One of the books that I loved, absolutely loved, and used a lot in writing Remixed Judaism was a book published by the CCAR Press, that's the Reform Movement's press, called The Sacred Table. The editor is Rabbi Mary Zamor. The volume is phenomenal, and it consists mostly of, I think, pretty much all Reform. I think everybody that wrote in there was a Reform rabbi giving their story about food, and the book really tries to come up with an ethic of kashrut, of keeping kosher for the Reform movement. That was the purpose of it. So I talk a lot about food in Remixed Judaism. One of my favorite examples of remix actually is a personal narrative. It's not in the book. It happened again after the book went to press, and it involved one of my daughters, my middle daughter, actually. And she just got married, but this was while they were, not yet married. And she said to me, she called me up one day, it was right before COVID, and she said, Mom, I want to tell you something. She said, Jeremy is no longer eating pork. And I'm like, thank God, because all I could think of is, frankly, a pork-free home that my grandchildren would be growing up in. So I was really, really excited about this. I said, I'm so glad, Rachel. And I said, is he trying to connect more with his Judaism? She asked, very hopefully. And my daughter says, no, not at all. I said, oh, okay, that's okay. I said, so what's motivating him? And she said, he feels badly for the animals. And I said, oh, okay. I said, well, that's great, Rach. And then I was thinking about it. It's like, well, wait a minute. I said, Rachel, is he giving up eating beef and hamburgers? Because I know he loves hamburgers. And she said, oh, no, not at all. He's just giving up eating pork and pig products. I was so confused. And this was all over the phone. I was driving at the time. I said, Rachel, I'm so confused. I said, well, I don't get it. Like, what's the difference? And then they're both big animal rights people. They just adopted a cat from Hawaii that they named Maui, that they found in the road. They rescued the cat, short detour. They took it to a humane society where it was fostered for 4 weeks, and the cat was just sent to them about 2 weeks ago. Like, they are major, major, major animal people. And she says to me, Mom, don't you know the pigs, they're treated so much worse than the cows are. I just burst out laughing. I couldn't help myself. I said, no, I didn't know that. I said, but you know what, Rachel, it doesn't matter why he's doing it. It doesn't make a difference at all, because what matters is that he's doing it. What matters is that you do it. It doesn't matter what his reasons are. She goes, well, isn't it bad that it's the wrong reason? Here we go again with the wrong reason. I said, not at all. I said, the thing is, your kids will be growing up in a pork-free home, and you can explain to your children that daddy's doing it for this reason and you're doing it for another reason, or you may or may not be doing it, but that people have different reasons for what it is that they do. But the important point is that this is part of Jewish tradition. This is part of Jewish tradition. And so that was quite exciting. But that's a remix, because again, the action is there, but the thinking process behind it is completely different. Another version, another example of remix, and this is probably one of my favorite ones. And this story actually is in the book. It's in the introduction. It appeared in the JUF News pretty much when I was pretty much done with the book, but I loved this story so much that I had to include it in the book. So this actually came out in an article that was written by one of your members, right? It was written, and she's part of my mishpacha, part of my family. So this was written by Leslie Hill Hirschfeld. And I think this really encapsulates the concept of remix. So in this story, this was, I think it was published probably 4 years ago, it came out. And so she has three, as some of you know, she has three boys, three sons, and I think they're all in grammar school now. At the time, they were in Jewish preschool. I think they were actually at Bethel. And the boys were having a hard time settling down at night. They were having bad dreams, whatever. So Leslie decided that she would lay with each of her sons separately, and they would sing the first line of the Shema together. And she did that with each of her boys. And she did that, consistently. And she did that every night. And the boys, it worked. The boys settled down. They stopped having bad dreams. And she wrote about this in the JUF News and said, I loved hearing a little bit of Torah on their sweet little lips before they went to sleep. This is a phenomenal story. Now, why is this remixed? Well, this is remixed because there actually is a version of the Shema that religious Jews say before they go to sleep at night. It's called the Shema Mita. Mita is bed. And that's what religious people do. But this wasn't her motivation. She wanted to get her boys to settle down and not have bad dreams. Is there consistency? Absolutely. Is it based in authenticity? As I just said, absolutely. And I love the idea that, and I think her boys are still doing this themselves now, which is phenomenal. And I think the idea here is that it sets the groundwork for Jewish practice, which hopefully the boys will continue, and maybe even when they have kids will want to do. So again, these are some of the examples of remixed Judaism. So before we open it up for questions, I'd love to tell you just a little more about what is in the book. I am so excited that the paperback edition, which is updated, and I wrote a preface for the paperback edition, it's coming out at the end of the month. So you have a choice of buying the original on hard copy if you choose to buy it, or using the updated paperback edition. Paperback edition is actually it's a lot cheaper, and I was really glad the publisher agreed to do a paperback because it's a 1/3 less in terms of the price, which is great from my perspective. But I want to just tell you a little bit about what's in there. So, I picked topics that I thought would resonate with my audience. The first chapter after the introduction is really on Shabbat and holidays, because again, that's the starting point for Jewish tradition in my view. And that's where I really develop these concepts of remix and apply them to the different holidays. The second chapter is my food chapter. And the third chapter was a challenging chapter to write. The third chapter is on marriage. And I had to tackle in that chapter, not just Jewish marriage, but also intermarriage. I spent a lot of time on that chapter making sure that it was open, it was accessible, and still authentic to my voice. I gave it to friends of mine who are not Jewish that are married to Jewish people. I gave it to, a variety of people who could really look at it and look at the tone. But, I do talk about intermarriage and how it meshes with remix, and also what the traditional functions of Jewish marriage are. After that, I have a chapter on children's Jewish education and B'nai Mitzvah. That has been completely remixed over the past, 10 to 15 years. And I talk about a lot of the updates that have gone on in terms of Jewish education. I have a chapter on grandparenting. I've been told that chapter is worth the price of the whole book. It was a fun chapter for me to write. I was not a grandparent for most of the time that I wrote that chapter. Our little special dividend came toward the end of that process, but I have a lot of friends who are grandparents. And so I took basically that chapter is written in narrative. It's not written, it's like fictional narratives, which is different from the rest of the book. And it really basically is a composite of a lot of people that I know as grandparents and the challenges as they have had with their grandchildren, raising their grandchildren or helping to raise their grandchildren. And it tells the story of how remix can be used in a variety of circumstances where there are obstacles or perceived obstacles. I also have a chapter on Tikkun Olam. I call it the most celebrated form of remix. And I talk about why Tikkun Olam is great, but from a continuity standpoint, it's not sufficient. And my last substantive chapter is on mourning, the Jewish mourning rituals, which I think, and there I tell my narrative, my story, how I remixed during the 2 years that I mourned each of my parents, even though that lens is through a traditional lens, but it was still remix that was going on. And finally, my last chapter looks at really important topics, in future forward, such as faith. Where does faith fit in? And more on authenticity, right? That, to come back to Rabbi Lisa's comment. And also what some emerging Jewish institutions are doing. Because again, we're seeing a drop in affiliation and particularly in the youngest generations. So I want to conclude before we open it up for questions and comments. I want to conclude with a quote by Rav Kook, who was the first chief rabbi of Israel before it became a state. And I think, again, this quote really captures exactly what remix is. And I think this also goes back, Rabbi Lisa, to the point that you made a few moments ago about authenticity. So this is what Rabbi Kook has to say. He said, I'm going to read it first in Hebrew and then I'll translate. Hayashan yitchadesh, the old shall become new. The chachadash yitkadesh, and the new shall become sanctified. The old shall become new and the new shall become sanctified. And so I think that is a perfect synopsis of my concept of remixed Judaism. And with that, I would love to, open it up for, what do you think, Rabbi Lisa, questions, comments, however you think we should.
So I invite you to either raise your hand either through the screen icon, or if you want to put your hand up if you're not screen savvy, or put your question in the chat if you have a question for Bobby.
Did you want to talk more about reform?
So, I loved your book, as a Reform Jew who lives Reform Judaism with integrity, I live what you call remixed Judaism. For me, I call it Reform Judaism. So, I guess I'm sort of wrestling with the need for another name. So Reform Judaism and even conservative Judaism. Conservative Judaism, I don't mean even in a lesser way, but I say this.
I know.
I have Reform Jewish friends who are halakhic, define themselves as halakhic, and those who make, give no particular thought to their choices and everything in between. But many people live with the integrity that you're describing, and who would even describe themselves as religious or observant.
Right. So I love that question, right? And I think, what lies behind it is, so what is new? What is different? Isn't this really Reform Judaism? Conservative Jews might say this is conservative Judaism, right?
Very easily.
So here's my response. The theory of conservative Judaism, the theory of Reform Judaism, they're different theories. I think everybody here knows that. The theory of reform is different from the theory of conservative, but in terms of the actualization of those theories, there's some commonality. The problem, and this is what we see from Pew, the problem is that religious practice and practice of religious tradition has taken a backseat, too much of a backseat. And that's why I believe that we need more focus on religious tradition and on observance. And that's the missing piece. And I think that is true in Reform communities. I think that's true in conservative communities. Reconstructing Judaism, actually, it's interesting. Their clergy has sometimes said, but this is all about what reconstructing Judaism is. And we really focus on practice and we really focus on that. And I understand that. But again, I come back to the 85% of American Jews who are not maybe clergy and who are not maybe among the most observant in their communities. They need to think more about how to get from, we are proud Jews, right? We have a Jewish identity, to we are going to continue to exist in a form other than Orthodoxy in the next 50 years. And if you look at the statistics, and Pew is as clear as it can be on this, especially when you look at the youngest cohort Pew studied in 2020, which was 18 to 29, there is becoming a schism between those who basically are very strong in their religious observances, meaning complete observance of halakha, and even more to the right than was the case 20 years ago in Orthodoxy and 30 years ago, and those who are basically doing nothing. And so I come from the position that we need to be talking more about ritual. We need to be thinking more about ritual, and remixed Judaism, I think, is the way that liberal Jews, liberally religious Jews, can actually think about ritual practice in a way that makes sense for them.
So you and I are saying the same things from a different bent, and I'm not looking to create controversy. I mean, I think there are many on this call who I look, everyone I know on this call who lives
differing degrees, but with lives their own ritual lives with integrity, right? And I don't disagree with you that ritual grounds it. And I regularly say to parents, if you're going to create ritual for your children, certainly have Jewish ritual in that mix, right? And we've done incredible research and work with a task force for our younger grades that actually I believe Leslie was a part of, right? Right around the time when she wrote that essay. But it's not antithetical to what reform is. I mean, if you reform in the early 19th century, where they cast off a lot of ritual,
right?
It is not at all antithetical.
It's not. I agree.
The integrity of Reform Judaism is to find meaningful time in your age, which includes adding ritual back. And like your chapter on mourning practices is a really great one, right? I mean, people mourn in many different ways. We've created a new Yizkor service. It's fascinating. Like your book really made me think about it. I was like, well, that's how I was raised and how I live and how I, for almost 27 years, gosh, I'm old, have tried to teach people. But I don't believe that it's antithetical to being reformed. It may be how.
Not at all. You're right. It's not antithetical at all.
Right.
But again, but I think, again, the conversation about practice, right? This is a small Zoom, relatively small Zoom screen. And I love being able to have conversations with people in a more intimate setting, right? And even COVID, as sick as we all are of COVID, right? But COVID, when you launch a book, 3 weeks before COVID, everything for me got canceled that I had for the spring, every single event. But I had the opportunity to speak to hundreds of Jews that I wouldn't otherwise have had that opportunity, because I could never have traveled that much and taken time off from work. But the number of people, I just read recently, I was just reading a really interesting article in Tablet magazine. I save up all the stuff to read for Shabbat. And it was on Emil Hirsch, and it was written in Tablet magazine. It was a really interesting article. It's primarily about Zionism.
Reform Zionism, right?
Pardon?
About Reform Zionism, right?
About Reform Zionism. But the statistic that was in there was that there's probably 850 Reform synagogues in the United States. Well, I've maybe had the privilege of speaking at maybe 50 of them. Okay, that's a lot of synagogues. That's a lot of synagogues, but I feel it's the tip of the iceberg. And I feel that for so many Jews, even Jews who are affiliated with a synagogue, and not just a Reform synagogue, a conservative synagogue as well, ritual practice and thinking about it mindfully and thinking about it from the standpoint of transmissibility, I don't think those are the front and center conversations that we're having now in communities. And what I'm trying to do is bring those conversations more to the fore. And I think it's important that we do that.
We're on the same page. We're absolutely, that's what our coach should do. But I thank you. I appreciate your spelling that out. It's
sure, no, absolutely.
And nuanced conversation on that. I want to stop talking and turn to you all. Questions for Bobby, reflections? Whether you've read the book or not, it's fine. You don't have to acknowledge it. Gary, please jump in. And by the way, I did put in the chat the link for Bobby's book. Gary and then Jody.
Okay. Bobby, really enjoyable lecture. Thank you so much for doing this for us. Maybe you'll comment a little more about it. You said that you have a chapter on faith, perhaps on struggles with faith and different ideas of faith. And in a way, that's where the whole command system would come from. You feel commanded. So I'm just going to keep the question as general as possible. Any thoughts about the very differing ideas of faith, how it influences the remix?
Sure. So faith, and Gary, Dr. Friend, you put it very, very well. Like faith, I think, can be challenging for a lot of people. In the epilogue of the book, I talk about the span of that challenge. And I talk about the fact that for many Jews in particular, faith is a fluid concept. I think part of that, we can explain as our history. Part of it is that we're a very intellectualized people and sometimes thinking too much. My husband always says religion is an art and not a science. And I actually agree with my husband on that. So, I think faith can be challenging for people, but I also think that there can be people who are not necessarily totally sure about their faith, or they're agnostic or whatever, but they still feel that there's something important about preservation of Jewish tradition. And so I think it's important to talk about faith in the sense of saying for many Jews, it's fluid. Okay, it's fluid for other religions too, but the study shows for Jews it's particularly fluid. But that doesn't necessarily change for me the concept of remix. Now, I will share with you one quick story about faith in particular that actually happened. So my agent, I'm represented by Amaria Orenstein of Go Literary, and she said to me, Bobby, don't ever engage on Facebook with critics. Fortunately, I didn't really get a lot of critics on Facebook, but I did get one that was scalding. It was somebody that basically, and this was a while ago, that was just really upset that I didn't talk about faith, and they just were, whatever. So I looked up who this person was, and I saw they were an Orthodox Jew who lives in Teaneck, which is a very, Orthodox area in New Jersey. That is a very Orthodox area. And I just couldn't help myself. Like I heard my agent's voice in my head, but I was like, no, I'm gonna write to him. So we had a little bit of stuff on Facebook, and then we went to DM. We went to private DMs because we became friends. So he was operating obviously from an Orthodox perspective. You have to have emunah, you have to have faith. If you don't have faith, none of this means anything. I get that that's a very Orthodox perspective. And he was also struggling actually with one of his children who was what they call off the path. They call it off the derech. And so we actually became friends. We would start sending each other things that we wrote. We actually were having conversations. And I was trying to explain to him how faith is nuanced among non-Orthodox people and why it's nuanced and why my book doesn't deal with faith, because I'm trying to encourage people to observe, which you don't necessarily have to have faith to be observing, especially under a remixed approach. So one of my greatest joys about this book, and we became friends and we're still friends, is that maybe about 8 months ago, we were going back and forth about something. And he wrote me an email and he said, Bobby, I see now we are fighting the same fight. He does outreach. He's a Kira outreach worker in the Orthodoxy. He said, we're fighting the same fight. And the fact that he was able to see that was amazing, because he's coming from a very traditional Jewish perspective with a very traditional view of Jewish faith, but he also he was able to understand that for everybody, faith isn't the complete driver, and we all have to be talking to each other. So that's, again, this book isn't about people should or shouldn't have faith. I try to meet people where they are and just encourage observance. So Jody, I think you had your hand up.
Thanks, Karen.
I'm freezing, forgive me. That's not on Jewish, it's back to your intellectual property. I saw a great movie last night on Amazon Prime called Book of Love, which I recommend to you as an intellectual property about how much can a book be changed and still be the authors. It's very cute. It's on Amazon Prime called Book of Love. So I recommend it to you. You'll love it.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thanks, Jody.
Appreciate that.
Other questions? Tracy, go ahead. You look freezing, Tracy, or else.
It might be a little loud. I'm in Starbucks. Sorry, it's kind of cold. But first off, I have not read the book, but I started reading the book and loved what I read so far, and immediately thought of my dad. But he passed away, but he would have loved this book. And thinking about the future generations, Rabbi Greene and Lisa, I think for sure anybody that's associating with any temple, reform or conservative, is going to be living this life. But I think there are a lot of people that are unaffiliated, maybe in this age group, that are thinking about this, and who knows what their future will be. And if they get their hands on this book, it might give them some food for thought. And that's my thought. That's my take on it. And I have shared the book with a couple of my friends, and they're I'm in this weird age, I think, where my daughter's just 25. So dating and things like that. But as I become as she gets married and hopefully become a grandma and things like that, I'm sure we'll be going through some of these issues, perhaps, who knows. But I find the book great. I'm enjoying it. And like I said, I enjoyed what I read so far, and thanks for writing it.
Well, thank you. I
thank you,
appreciate that.
speakers, too.
I appreciate that, Tracy. And, for those of us who do have, either grandchildren or special others, nieces, nephews, cousins, whatever, any kind of, younger person. I mean, that does sort of give us, some opportunities to be thinking these things through. One of the things that I have found probably the most frustrating is whenever I do a talk, I consistently, the people that I'm speaking to look very much like this group, which is fabulous. And I'm so grateful. But there are times I would love to get people in their 30s, even their early 40s, who are in the throes of raising their kids. And the problem, of course, as I will remember from raising my kids, is that, that they just don't have the time. So it's, it's challenging. Yes, I see a Deborah.
Debbie, go ahead.
Okay, I got it. You use the word fluid. I'm sorry, I haven't read the book, but it sounds fascinating. You use the word fluid with faith. Could you also use the word fluid with the word reform and remix? So is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think remix definitely is, yeah, sure. I mean, fluid to me is the opposite of something that's set and firm, right? So fluid means there's some blurring around the margins, or there's some blurring within the center, right? So yeah, I think that would fit, sure.
Thank you.
Thanks, Debbie. I want to, Bobby, I had a crazy thought while Tracy was talking really powerfully
About looking at Becca and looking, have you read, some of the people in the club heard Sarah Hurwitz speak and
Oh my gosh.
and read her book? I feel like you two should be together because
Well, I'm going to tell you, okay, so Sarah Hurwitz.
Sarah Hurwitz was Michelle Obama's speechwriter. She spoke here right before
Yep.
COVID, exactly 2 years ago. But some of you have read her book.
Yeah.
Blanking.
So here's a cute story about Sarah Hurwitz, right? Sarah Hurwitz, her book launched in September of 2019, right? It was.
She spoke here in January 2020.
Right. So Sarah, as soon as her book came out, I looked her up and I tried to find her. Well, she's not a law professor, so it's not like anybody who wants to find me can easily find me if they just know where I'm teaching, or even if they don't. Sarah Hurwitz wasn't easy to find. And certainly anybody who had been working at that high level of governmental service probably just wouldn't have their email around, right? Okay. So what ended up happening was I bought her book immediately. I read her book. I really enjoyed her book. And I said, I've got to connect with this person. So I couldn't get her on email. So I looked at her acknowledgements. And of course, I knew maybe a third of the people that she was acknowledging. So I wrote to all of them saying, would you give me Sarah's email address? I really want to contact her. And of course I got her email. So I write to Sarah, and it was probably about 2 hours. It was on Friday afternoon. It was like 2 hours before Shabbat was starting. I told her who I was. I told her why I was writing. I told her I want to connect with you. And I never expected she would write back. She wrote back before Shabbos started. So I got the email like an hour later. And she said, yeah, I'm coming to Chicago. I'm speaking at Northwestern. And I said, great, let's have lunch. So Sarah and I started this wonderful friendship. And then the last event I did before COVID was March 4th of 2020. Sarah and I did a program together at DePaul. My youngest daughter, Nisa, moderated it. It was for JWI, Jewish Women's International. And Sarah and I did this. It was great. It was like, we had refreshments. I mean, it was March 4th. It was so close to the shutdown, but life was still normal. And so Sarah and I developed this friendship, and then we've stayed in touch. And I do a podcast that I co-host with Rabbi Avi Feingold, who is Orthodox, actually, called Remix Your Judaism. Sarah was our last guest. The podcast will be released. I don't know. Avi tells me it'll be a few weeks until it's, edited and ready. So she was our last guest, and we had her on. So she's wonderful. Sarah, I think.
Give a 411. Not everybody may know who she is. So just give 411. She's essentially, I guess she's a millennial. I mean, she, in her late 20s, connected with the Judaism through ritual practice, and then did a lot of incredible amount of research and writing, and wrote a book when she finished her work in government, at least in that tenure. So I say this to Bobby because you're speaking as a parent of that age, which we all know if we tell our kids to do something, my kids are a little younger, they don't necessarily listen, but the narrative in Sarah's practice, right,
and the narratives in your story like often speak powerfully to, to
Yeah.
their peers. So I was thinking like you guys should go on the road together, but you already are. That's
yeah, it was really nice. I mean, one of the fun things about this was meeting people, like Sarah and others, and just being able to engage. And so, and I'd forgotten she had spoken at North Shore. That was like right after her book had launched. So yeah.
Oh, that's a great, well, I guess my day wasn't so crazy. Other questions from you all?
To sign off. Thank you. Nice to
too.
see you.
Um,
Too.
And just one thing, Bobby,
Okay.
are you willing to give an email address if some of us wish to contact you, or? do you
Oh,
do-
absolutely. I mean, I'm easy to find. I'm at DePaul. It's just rquall@depaul.edu.
Our Kwall at the
I have it too.
rquall@depaul.edu.
So on one foot, as we say in the world of Jewish wisdom and teaching, what's your best counsel for those seeking Jewish meaning? Like if you had to put it in an elevator speech, what would it be?
Well, for seeking Jewish meaning, you can't counsel that because that's so individualistic, right? It has to be, whatever meaning you can find. If you light your candles because it gives you a time to recap the week, that's great. If you do it because it gives you a time to talk to your deceased parents, that's great. I mean, meaning is a very personalized thing. But what I would say is that from the standpoint of transmissibility, consistency and joy. It's
Love
got to
it.
focus on the positive.
Love it. Consistency and joy. We will carry that into this new week. Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov to everyone.
Professor Kwall, thank you so much for joining us and
Thank you, Rabbi Lisa, for
sharing your
having me.
wisdom.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
It's
you.
great
Yeah.
seeing.
Shared the link in the chat. It's also on Amazon. You can look it up under Bobby's name. Thanks all. Have a good day, good week, and stay warm in this crazy weather. Take care. Good to be with you.
Bye,
Thank you.
everybody. Thank you.
Bye.